It's something we all see, right? The person on the street corner all bundled up, or maybe it's a tent city under the freeway. Homelessness.
Yeah.
It's global, but I'll admit, I don't know, it's easy to just see it and not really get it.
It is. It's one of those things that a lot of people kind of shy away from. But, the reality is that homelessness is tied up with so many other issues like poverty and mental health and global housing markets.
Yeah.
And we've got some research and stories today that really highlight those connections.
The UN, they estimate that 1.6 billion people worldwide lack adequate housing.
Wow.
That's a lot, isn't it?
That's huge. And it forces us to really think about, like, what does homelessness even mean? It's not just about sleeping on the streets. It includes people in shelters, people who are couch surfing because they don't have a home, families living in places without even basic things like running water.
Yeah. We're going to be talking about Michelle's story today, Nara,
Right.
who fled a violent home at 16.
Yeah, and her story, sadly, is not unique, but it does show us how vulnerable young people are, especially those escaping abuse.
And, one of the things I thought was interesting is how different homelessness looks depending on where you are in the world.
Oh, absolutely.
What are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, in developed nations, you often see individuals in big cities downtown, and they face harsh weather, social stigma. You think of like the classic image of somebody huddled in a doorway during a snowstorm.
Right.
But in developing countries, it often looks like huge slums or informal settlements.
Yeah.
So millions of people living in inadequate housing, they don't have secure tenure. Things like clean water and sanitation are lacking.
Well, two very different faces of the same crisis. But what connects them?
That's a really good question, and it leads us to one of the most important things that drives homelessness, and that is the lack of affordable housing.
Let's get into that. So we're not just talking about individual circumstances, right?
Yeah.
It seems like there's much bigger things at play.
Absolutely. I mean, we're talking skyrocketing rents, gentrification, pushing people out of their homes, and a lack of government investment in public housing.
Yeah.
And this is happening everywhere, Vancouver, Mumbai. So many people just can't earn enough to live.
Yeah. And I mean, that puts a lot of pressure on families, forces them into really tough situations.
Right.
So is that where we see these policies failing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the policies we have actually make things worse. Like some countries actually make homelessness a crime. You can't sleep in public. You can't even ask for money.
Really? So instead of helping, they're punishing people for being homeless.
Sadly, yes. And it doesn't work. These laws lead to fines, jail time. It just keeps people in poverty.
Michelle's story, she talks about this a bit, right? She talks about being afraid of being arrested just for trying to find a place to sleep.
Absolutely, yeah. She talks about hiding from the police, feeling like she was a criminal just for being in public.
That's dehumanizing.
It is.
What about shelters? Are they not a solution?
Well, shelters are supposed to be temporary, but they're often overcrowded, underfunded, and sometimes even dangerous. Especially for women and young people like Michelle. It's hard to get your life back together when you're in a room full of strangers and you're worried about your safety.
I understand. Even getting into a shelter is really difficult.
Yeah.
Lots of red tape.
It's true. The system can be a barrier. There's so much bureaucracy, limited space, and often restrictions. You have to be sober, you have to have a job, and these requirements shut out a lot of the people who need the most help, people struggling with mental health and addiction.
So we've got this global housing crisis that's forcing people into really desperate situations, policies that punish people for being homeless, and shelters that are hard to get into, and sometimes just not good enough. It's kind of a bleak picture.
It is, and if we really want to understand this problem, we have to look deeper, look at the bigger systems that are at play.
It feels like we're talking about a system that's, failing the people it's supposed to help. But thankfully, I know we're not stopping with just the problems.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, the challenges are definitely there, but there are actually some really cool and effective solutions coming up all around the world. And, it's interesting. A lot of them are about changing how we think about homelessness.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. What's working? What gives you hope?
Well, one of the most promising models is called Housing First. And it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's about giving people permanent housing, but without any strings attached. Like you don't have to be sober or have a job.
So no hoops to jump through.
Yeah.
That seems pretty different from what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it is a pretty big shift. The main idea is that housing is a human right, and once you give someone a safe and stable place to live, they can start working on other things in their lives.
It's like saying, okay, let's make sure you got a place to live, And then we can work on addiction or finding a job or whatever else you need.
Exactly. It's really hard to focus on getting better or finding work when you don't know where you're going to sleep that night. And Finland, they're a great example. They've basically eliminated street homelessness using this approach.
Eliminated. Wow. But Finland is a pretty small country, right?
hmm
Can something like that work in, I don't know, a bigger, more complicated place?
Well, that's what a lot of people wonder. It's not going to be the same everywhere, but there are successes in different places. Like Utah in the US, they've seen some big reductions in chronic homelessness using housing first.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Mm.
So if housing first is like a key strategy, what else needs to happen along with it to really address the problem?
Well, we can't talk about homelessness without talking about the elephant in the room, which is the lack of affordable housing. We have to put more resources into creating housing options that people can actually afford.
Right, but it's not just about building more houses, is it? What would a good, I don't know, holistic approach look like?
It's got to be multi-pronged. Things like, subsidies for low-income renters, rent control to keep prices from going crazy, and even some newer ideas like public-private partnerships to develop mixed-income housing.
So creating different kinds of housing options and making sure that housing is a right, not just something for rich people.
Yeah.
Are there any cities or countries that are like doing this well?
Vienna is a great example. They've been focusing on social housing for decades, and now over 60% of the people who live there live in subsidized housing. It's a place where affordable housing is just like normal.
That's pretty powerful. It shows what can happen when a whole society decides that housing is important. And speaking of, commitments, we were talking about those policies that make homelessness a crime. Are there any good alternatives out there?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Decriminalizing homelessness is so important. It's about moving away from punishment and towards support. So instead of giving people tickets or throwing them in jail for sleeping outside, let's use those resources to create safe shelters and programs that can help people get back on their feet.
It seems like common sense, but I bet it's hard for, politicians to get away from those old ways of thinking. Are there examples of this actually happening?
Yeah, there are cities trying new things, like Portland, Oregon. They've got a program of legalized encampments. So they're providing designated areas with bathrooms, security, and people can connect with social services.
Oh, that's interesting. So instead of pushing people away, they're creating a space where they can, be safe and get help.
Exactly. It's about meeting people where they are and helping them get to a better place. And, it's important to remember that a lot of people end up homeless because of things like trauma and abuse.
That's true. Michelle's story. She talks about how leaving that violent home when she was so young, it left her with nothing, no safety net.
Right. And her experience shows how important it is to have support systems specifically for people who have survived abuse, especially young people.
So what would that look like? What kind of support?
Well, think of things like safe houses with all kinds of services, like counseling, legal help, job training, education, things like that. There are some great nonprofits in Canada that are doing this. They understand that you have to deal with the trauma before people can really move forward.
So it's more than just putting a roof over their heads, right?
Yeah.
It's about dealing with the root causes, giving people the tools they need to heal and, to really thrive. And of course, there's a whole issue of mental health and addiction, right? We can't ignore that.
Of course not. Mental health and addiction support are super important. It might mean things like mobile outreach teams, clinics just for people experiencing homelessness, or peer support programs.
It seems like, I don't know, the traditional ways of doing healthcare don't always reach these folks.
Mm.
They might not have a car to get to appointments or insurance, or maybe they just don't feel comfortable going to a regular clinic.
Exactly. So you got to be creative. You got to bring the services to them. Australia has a program called EdSpace. It's for young people, and it's all about early intervention and support, and it's designed to be accessible and welcoming.
That makes sense. Meet people where they are, literally and emotionally. But what about the bigger economic forces, the things that are contributing to homelessness in the first place? Is there anything we can do about that?
That's where some of the more radical ideas come in, like universal basic income or UBI.
I've heard of that. It was just giving everyone free money, right?
It's a little more than that. It's about giving everyone a basic income, no matter if they're working or not, so everyone has enough money to cover the basics. And the idea is that it would help prevent people from becoming homeless.
Oh, I see. So if you know you've got that safety net, you're less likely to end up on the street if you lose your job or something. Does it actually work, though?
Well, there have been some really promising pilot programs, like in Stockton, California, and they found that it really helped reduce financial stress. People were more likely to keep their housing, and it even led to better health. It's not, a perfect solution, but it's worth looking into.
So it's about preventing the problem, addressing those underlying causes of poverty rather than just reacting to homelessness after it happens. I like that.
Yeah.
What else can we do to make a real change, a lasting change?
Well, one thing that's really important is realizing that communities often know what they need better than anyone, so we need to let them be part of the solution.
What does that look like?
There are some really great models out there, like community land trusts, where residents can own and manage affordable housing together. In Brazil, there are programs helping people in informal settlements get legal rights to their homes.
So it's about giving people more control, rather than imposing solutions from the top down.
Exactly. And it reminds us that there are solutions out there. We just have to be willing to listen to the people who are most affected. And of course, we can't forget about global cooperation. Homelessness is a global issue, so it needs a global response.
Right. We need to share what's working
Hmm.
and help each other out.
Exactly. Organizations like the UN, they can help connect people and share best practices.
And advocacy groups are important too, right? They keep this issue in the spotlight.
Oh, yeah, they're crucial. They give a voice to people who are experiencing homelessness and make sure that governments are doing what they need to do.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Moving away from punishment, focusing on housing and support, new ideas like housing first, affordable housing, community solutions. But there's one big thing we haven't really talked about, and it seems really important.
I think I know what you're getting at, the stigma around homelessness.
Exactly. The idea that it's a personal failing, a choice, that people are lazy or addicted. It seems like that stigma gets in the way of progress.
Oh, absolutely. And that's why it's so important to raise awareness, to change those negative perceptions, and to remind people that these are real human beings.
It does feel like stories can really change how people think. Like Michelle's story, it really made me see youth homelessness in a new way.
Yeah, for sure. When you hear someone's story, you start to see the person, not just a number. And I think you realize that, most of the time it's not their fault. It's a bunch of things. Bad luck.
It's like you were saying, moving away from reacting to a problem and trying to prevent it in the first place.
Yeah.
And it seems like fighting that stigma, that's a big part of prevention, isn't it?
Oh, totally. We need to build a culture where people understand, where there's compassion. See homelessness as something we all need to deal with, not just give some money to charity and forget about it.
So as we kind of wrap things up here, what are the big things you hope people listening will take away from all this? What really stayed with you after, all the research and hearing Michelle's story?
For me, the biggest thing is that homelessness is something we can solve. It's not like, oh, well, that's just how the world is.
Right.
If we have the right policies, if we put in the money, if we change how we think about it as a society, we can make things better.
That's helpful. And, everything we've talked about today shows that there are solutions, right? Like housing first, making sure there's enough affordable housing, not treating homelessness like a crime, having support services, letting communities lead the way, working together around the world.
Yeah, and we can't forget about what individuals can do. Everyone can do something to make their community a better place.
Right. So what would you tell someone who's listening? What can they do?
I'd say start by learning more about the issue. Really challenge your own assumptions. Talk to your friends and family about it. Support those organizations that are doing great work, whether it's volunteering, donating, or even pushing for bigger policies.
Every little bit counts.
Absolutely. Even just being kind to someone who's homeless can make a difference.
Yeah. Michelle's journey is a powerful reminder that, behind all the numbers and policies, there are real people with real stories. And they deserve our compassion. They deserve to be understood, and we need to do something.
Right. She went through so much, but, her strength, her wanting to build a better life, it's inspiring.
Her story is a call to action for all of us.
It is. So think about what you can do, even if it seems small, to help create a world where everyone has a place to call home.